Ryan, and I'm with the channel Overlordshiny. Today's topic is the Lumineth, and where they come from. For those of you who are familiar with the old world, they were commonly referred to as High Elves, and while they are not a direct comparison faction, you can tell where one faction, the Lumineth, were inspired by the previous High Elves. So let's get started. First up on the list is Eltharion. He was originally introduced back in 4th edition, along with the rest of the High Elf faction. Keep in mind, they were never one of the original factions, and only until 4th edition did most of these models get released. Now, Eltharion had two different variants. The first one was Eltharion the Grim, which was his original model released in 4th edition. The second model, released in 6th edition, was known as Eltharion the Blind. The big difference between the models is Eltharion the Blind was just a regular hero unit. He was Eltharion without his signature helmet, and he had a blindfold on and his two-handed sword. Now, the lore here is that he was the very first High Elf general to successfully invade the Dark Elf homelands of Naggaroth. Naggareth? Unsure the pronunciation there. And when he had done so, he was actually captured by Malekith, who blinded him. In Age of Sigmar, he is now known as Malarion. But Malarion and Malekith are the same character, just different battle systems. Now, the model itself was pretty cool, both versions. The lore, he was an okay character. He was subsequently outshined by both Teclis and Tyrion and Alariel the Radiant, as she was known back in the day. Now, I'm going to be a little harsh on Eltharion here, and that's purely because of how Warhammer Fantasy worked. See, back in the day, the hero units were obscenely powerful, and a lot of them had the potential to ruin mountains and destroy cities with a flick of their hand, and some of them were gods like Nagash, and some of them were the best of the best. Some of them were fallen kings like Elithanar, and some of them were so powerful they survived the destruction of the world that was. Amongst them, Tyrion and Teclis. So for the lore behind Eltharion, he doesn't quite reach those lofty heights. He was a well-rounder back in the day. He could do both spellcasting and he can do both. He had a mounted creature he rode on. He was pretty good at melee, but he really wasn't worth the points. Now, that doesn't really translate the same way into his current incarnation, which bears little resemblance to his previous form. That being said, he does have a remarkably similar helmet and a remarkably similar sword, but that's where it really all ends. And even then, comparing the sword and the helmet is that they share similar silhouettes, but the interior details are vastly different. In the end, I do think the new Eltharion model is fantastic. I think it shows a great placement of negative space, and a whole unit of combat armor would be fantastic. I think that Age of Sigmar is missing that at the moment, and it's a good place for the Lumineth to expand outside of the 4 elements. Teclis was released in 4th edition along with the rest of the High Elves. In fact, the High Elves were actually introduced in a starter set where they squared off against goblins. Tyrion was also released along with this edition, and it was kind of a running theme to say that they're released in 4th edition, since that's sort of where the birth of the High Elves kind of occurred. The design for Teclis has changed so dramatically, I think it's actually easier to say what hasn't changed as opposed to what has. In Teclis' case, his helmet is the thing that is most similar. He is sporting the same half-moon shape, although a lot more elongated at this point. That sort of exemplified who he was from the previous editions. Another model with a direct correlation will be the Venari Starshard Ballista. Now, this one's quite obvious, as it mimics a lot of the same logic applied to the Eagle Claw Repeater Bolt Thrower. Also originally released in 4th edition in metal and never really graduated beyond that, the Eagle Claw, or the Repeater Bolt Thrower, was a staple in the artillery of the High Elves. Now, the High Elves themselves were a very offensive-focused army, and they preferred to attack first as opposed to second. And this was in the rules. We'll talk about that more in a moment. Let's just get through all the other models first. We don't have many left, actually. The next model on the list will be the High Elf Spearmen and the Swordmasters. These premiered in 4th, like everything else did practically, and they were in metal. They never actually made it out of metal except for when they premiered in the Island of Blood starter set, where they transitioned into plastic. The Island of Blood starter set was actually considered to be at the time a very well done starter set, particularly for Skaven players for that matter. The new updated versions are now known as the Venari Aurelian Wardens in the case of the Spearmen, and the Venari Blade Lords in the case of the Swordmasters. The designs and inspirations are quite obvious when it comes to the weapons. The Lumineth tend to have more cloth and plate armor as opposed to the High Elves, where they had more plate and, I want to say, scale mail, not necessarily ring mail, but they had scale mail that would kind of cover their whole entire body with their pointed hats, and they had the tassels on top, and then their chest would be protected by an additional layer of plate mail. In the case of the Lumineth, it's actually quite different in that the scale mail is mostly hinted to at this point, actually. You can see it right on the shield on the lower part, as well as in front of the growing and armpit areas to protect those vital weak spots that the High Elf armor traditionally did not cover in the previous world that was. Now, this does mark a different design philosophy in that they are still trying to remind you that these are the High Elves from previous editions. And you can see that because the homage of the scale mail is a direct counterpart to the previous world that was. Now, the High Elf Noble in Standard was actually released in 7th edition for once, and it came in metal. Now, obviously, when we are comparing this, we are looking at a different model, the Venari Bannerblade. Now, I don't think it's a huge ask to say that these two are directly comparable, mostly because the High Elves actually only had one character that had a standard by himself, and that was the Noble. The design comparisons are quite different, however, in that, for one, they call it a world banner just to kind of give you an idea of how big this thing is, and it's massive. Other than the sword, they are remarkably different models. The same cannot be said, however, for the Lore Master of Hoeth and its new incarnation, the Sigmar Lore Seeker. The Lore Master was actually released in 8th edition. It was one of the last updates the High Elves got before the world blew up, and if you look at the new Sigmar Lore Seeker, it's kind of obvious the inspiration here. The big thing to note is that the armor on the Lore Master is actually covering the armpit area, which is the same thing the Lore Seeker is doing. You could even say that this might have been the inspiration for the new updated armor for the Lumineth. The other notable things is that they're both carrying swords, both at actually a higher torso angle that almost mimic each other. That and the lore behind them is remarkably similar. They are a combination of spellcaster and swordsman, and they are said to be masters of both, making them incredibly rare. So, how did the High Elves play in the world that was? They were a very versatile army, and much like any of the elf armies from Fantasy Battles, they could not take a hit. They are very elite, they have great cavalry, flying monsters, fantastic magic, a great deal of ranged combat, and very offensively oriented. But, as our dwarven friends like to say, elves can't take a proper punch, and they have no cheap troops either. Age of Sigmar is a bit different here, in that most of their stuff is tanky actually. They have proper anvil units to pinch opposing units into place, and they have a good amount of battle line troops, which is 4 as of this video actually. Some armies would kill for that, like the Caradron Overlords for example. And that concludes our video for today. Thank you for sticking around while I illuminated the Lumineth. If you're a fan of my content or want to see more of my videos, feel free to subscribe. It's free to do. If you don't want to do it, it's okay. I don't like pressing buttons either. But until then, happy wargaming.